Thank you very much, Andrea, and thank you to Elanco for inviting me to speak today. It's really a pleasure to present to the third International Beef Symposium. So 2020 has really not been the year that we were hoping for in terms of sustainable beef or anything much else. I'm going to give you a few timelines about what happened during the year, both because of COVID and some other issues that we've been facing this year. The question really to ask ourselves is, was COVID the biggest issue for the meat supply, or were there other factors which were equally big influencing what went on in the meat markets this year? I'm going to give a little bit of a short-term view, what were the immediate impacts, and then try and imagine what the longer-term impacts are going to be and the future prospects for sustainable beef, but also for the meat markets in general. I think two of the real takeaways in my presentation are going to be that there is now increasing interest in where food comes from and how it's produced, and that we need to change the way we communicate to ensure that consumers understand that we have shared values, that we're working towards the same sustainable future that they are. So I alluded to the fact that there were other problems. I think the first real problem for us started well before 2020, and that was African swine fever. This time last year, we were all thinking that African swine fever would be the overwhelming influence, the biggest problem that we were going to face in the meat markets in 2020. And it did really have a massive impact on demand for other proteins. With a huge collapse in the size of the pig herd in China, we saw a massive increase in demand for other proteins. And it's not just in China, of course. The African swine fever epidemics have really cropped up all over the place. They're in wild swine now in Poland and Germany. And that's going to definitely have an impact on the ability of the EU, the second biggest producer of pig meat, to export to other regions. Now, the decline in the pork production in China was of around 28 million tons. And that in itself, that decline is more than the total amount of production from Europe. As I said, the second biggest producer region. And there's a map from OIE, the International Organization for Animal Health, in which you can see the number of outbreaks. The map there of China does not show the scale at all. There have been outbreaks throughout China, and this is just a 1-month snapshot. So the knock-on effects of this were really to massively increase the price of pork meat in China and obviously decrease the amount of production there. And that had a knock-on effect throughout all proteins. Now, chicken meat, the poultry industry, is the most able to respond rapidly. Chickens grow rapidly. The feed source for chickens is not entirely dissimilar from that of pork. So chicken can definitely fill some of the void. But the fact that 28 million tons of production of meat was taken out of the world market meant that all proteins in some way benefited, or at least felt the effects of that lack of pork. And Latin American beef certainly benefited as China pulled beef in from Latin America, Brazil in particular, but also Argentina and Uruguay. Australia and New Zealand also benefited from that change. In the meantime, we're seeing the US market for beef declining a little bit towards the end of this year. They had a dry summer again this year and some significant bushfires. So there were some sell-offs as producers had been facing both the impact of COVID and some of the other cyclical effects they have there. Now, the Chinese government, in the face of COVID, has really not tried to reduce meat consumption. With that massive exodus of pork from the market, the Chinese government has really stopped using any rhetoric around moving to plant-based. In fact, they're really looking for sources of meat. And meat is definitely seen as a positive source of protein in the Chinese diet. And at the moment, they're looking for more sources rather than talking about using more plant-based sources. So ironically, COVID has actually prevented some of those huge swings in markets from having the impact they might have had otherwise, because it was impossible for all of the demand in China to be met from other markets. And it was also really tragic to see that in the early stages of the pandemic in the United States, pigs were not being able to be slaughtered in the United States and were actually being destroyed and buried when there was a huge demand for that meat in other areas. This just gives you an idea. This is from Rabobank. They put out a quarterly review of the beef markets, and this shows the evolution of prices. You can see at the first part of January in 2020, we saw an increase in the price of beef, probably related to that increased demand in China. But then as the impact of COVID started to bite, we saw it decline again. So in terms of the short-term impacts of the outbreak, we really did see some massive supply chain holdups where processing plants were affected. So in the United States in particular, where capacity is very limited and they have exactly the right amount of capacity for their normal slaughter, if a plant was taken out of production due to an outbreak of COVID, that meant a big backlog building up. And that has knock-on effects both in supply to the market, but also in what happens to that cattle inventory. Are they still kept on feed? Are they still back on a farm somewhere? That has an impact for everybody in the chain, really. And that, in a sense, just exposed the fact that by becoming very efficient and having the exact right amount of capacity, we're also losing flexibility. And we probably need to have excess capacity so that we can take up slack when problems of those sorts emerge. What we also saw, of course, because food service restaurants were closed in many markets for quite substantial periods of time, and so there had to be a channel shifting of meat from the food service industry straight into retail or supermarkets. And we saw a big increase in online demand. People didn't want to physically go to the shops, and online sales. In Europe, for example, Europe and North America, we saw a massive increase, up to 3 to 4 times the expected growth in online sales because of COVID. And all of these factors had big repercussions for logistical and freight costs. Freight really became much more complicated, it became more expensive, and the lack of personnel to make sure it happened also led to delays and disruptions. The one maybe slightly positive thing in all of this was that because of a drop in the oil price, we also saw a drop in the feed corn price at the early stages of COVID back in sort of March and April. And that meant that for a time, input costs were actually down. So for those people who were left holding cattle or other inventory, at least the cost of maintaining it was not as high as it might have otherwise been. And a further exacerbating factor in terms of the summer for 2020, it started off as a very, very hot summer with huge areas of wildfires in Australia, also impacted on the cattle inventory there. And then in the US, later on in the year, we also had a very hot summer and significant wildfires. And that has also led to, I think the wildfires covered around about 1 million acres or 400,000 hectares. And that has also meant that it was less easy to maintain cattle on grass over the summer. Now I'll take a quick look at some consumer impacts. Consumers became much more interested in local supplies, local products, and they wanted transparency. They wanted to know where that food was coming from. And they also started to, not surprisingly, in the face of a human health pandemic, were really interested in the health of the food they were eating and the nutrition that it was going to provide them with. And because they weren't able to go out, and there was all of this channel shifting of meat into supermarkets, we saw a big increase in home preparation, a massive increase in the number of hits, for example, on recipe websites. The NCBA in the US runs a beef recipe website for consumers, and they saw an increase in millions of hits on their website as a result of the pandemic. It also led to a skewing of the assortment in supermarkets, because consumers are generally most comfortable preparing dishes with ground beef, certainly in North America, but in other markets as well. And I even saw that here in New Zealand, where there was a stage that ground beef, the price of ground beef was actually higher than the price of primals such as rump and even fillet, which is quite an extraordinary situation to find yourself in. So there was definitely a skewing in terms of what was going on in the consumer markets. And I suppose if we were to take a crystal ball and say which of these things are likely to persist into the future, I think there will still be a big interest from the consumer in local and transparent supply chains. They want to know. It's been an evolution over time. I would say COVID just exacerbated it. So it accelerated people's interest in local and in transparent supply chains. They want to know more about the story of where their food is coming from. Definitely direct to consumer is going to increase and has already increased, as I said. Online sales will continue. They may not be as high as they were at the height of the pandemic, but they are here to stay, and we're definitely going to see a lot more of that. And finally, for the consumer side, the need to build trust and talk about sustainability and demonstrate that we are producing in a sustainable way that is providing them with healthy and nutritious food is definitely here to stay. So I would say, if anything, the impact of COVID on sustainability has been to give it increased impetus. Now, the story in emerging economies, I've talked mostly so far about the developed countries or the wealthier economies. There is a very large cattle herd in Africa and Asia. In fact, the number of bovines in Africa and Asia is around about 60% of all of bovines, but that includes buffalo in India. That herd is very large, but it is not highly productive. With 60% of the bovines, around about 30% of bovine meat comes from Africa and Asia. And there's little financial activity, particularly from smallholder producers in Africa. And that's not to say that those animals are useless, but they're not providing an economic return on a regular basis. Now, we saw huge impacts of COVID on labor markets early in the outbreak. Certainly in India, you saw literally millions of people displaced because their jobs could not continue at that time. And that meant that they were typically returning to where they came from, often in rural areas. So there were very large impacts in population movements and therefore also on agricultural value chains. We saw in Africa that supply chains for inputs also slowed down. Veterinary supplies were more difficult to come by. Vaccinations and drugs both became more difficult to procure. And that meant that if there were disease outbreaks, they could create more problems than otherwise would have done. Obviously, having that drop in employment, for example, in India, led to a reduction in household income at a time when prices were going up. Now, in India, the meat consumption is not so high, but the price increases were not just in meat markets, they were also in all other food markets. One of the things that cushioned that slightly for developing countries, and this applies also into those beef exporters in Latin America, is that their economies and their currencies tended to suffer from devaluation quicker than the US dollar or the euro, for example. And so their currencies weakening did enable them to access more export markets than otherwise. But of course, what that also meant was that there was a drop in local consumption of beef in Brazil, for example. Smallholders are not able to sell into online markets. They're usually not able to buy from online markets. So the disruptions that they felt from their physical separation from the supply chain were bigger than what people felt in other regions. The smallholders have been disproportionately affected by this kind of impact. Now, in the longer term, this economic downturn is obviously going to be the largest one that any of us have experienced. So unless you're extremely old, this is the largest downturn since the Great Depression. All developed economies are now in recession, and the majority of developing countries are also in the recession. And because the increases in meat that we've seen over annually for decades, meat consumption have been tied to the growing middle class, particularly in emerging economies. The fact that they're all now in recession means that those increases are going to stagnate. And I have seen people incorrectly referring to this as being the end of growth in the meat markets. It's obviously a plateau caused by a recession. That doesn't mean that there won't be increased demand in the future. And we still need to find ways to sustainably meet that increasing demand in the future. We know that the populations of emerging economy countries are growing. We also know that once this recession starts to come to an end, possibly in the next few years, we will see increased demand again for meat. Now, the recovery of the pig herd, going back to African swine fever, will take a long time in China. And that has, as I said, been pretty healthy in terms of demand for other meats. Certainly Brazil, Argentina, Uruguay, etc., were able to benefit from that situation by selling beef into China. And Brazil, as I said, has switched to exports. But in the long term, that won't really be a beef win. It'll probably be more of a chicken win, because chicken is more in line with pork prices. Beef has always been more expensive than pork. And even though the price of pork actually doubled in China due to the ASF outbreak, it was still less expensive than beef. So we expect chicken to really make up for the majority of the lost supply over the next couple of years until the pig herd recovers. Of course, there's been a big new investment in plant protein manufacturers, and they are, of course, amongst the people citing peak meat and saying we've now reached the summit and meat supplies are going to, and meat demand is going to decline in the future. I'm not so sure. Of course, they would love that story to be true, because it would mean that demand for their product is growing. But they are increasing the quality, and they're also managing to reduce the price. So plant protein will definitely have a place in the overall protein picture. And I don't believe that it's going to replace other meats. I think it's an addition to meat. In terms of the impetus for sustainability, definitely there's been an increased concern around zoonoses and the spread of animal diseases to the human population. Of course, there's generally not a deep understanding amongst the general population of how these things work. And there were some early scare stories during the pandemic that livestock were somehow implicated in this. And okay, with the disease potentially arising in a wet market, you can see how that connection has been made. in terms of the major livestock species, there hasn't been an issue. We know that the disease, that COVID, was in mink farms in Europe, and that is a concern. But in general, this has just led to an increase in concerns around zoonoses and intensive production systems. Of course, consumer concerns do vary according to their disposable income. If you're poor, your first concern beyond filling your stomach is going to be for safety. Your next concern is definitely going to be price, and price continues a long way up, even to quite wealthy markets, price being the first consideration. And it's only once you get to a really quite high level of disposable income that you start to worry about nutrition, you know, the real detailed aspects of nutrition, and the ethics of the production. Now, supply chains do, on the whole, prefer these visible environmental actions so that they can actually show people this is what we're doing. But I think particularly this year, in response to COVID, there has been an increased recognition that we all of our industries, and particularly the meat industry that we're involved in, we need to be contributing to the Sustainable Development Goals, and we need to be demonstrating how we're on a path towards producing more with less, and reducing environmental, but also social and other impacts, and ensuring that that beef production can remain economically viable whilst meeting all these other societal needs. So in terms of policy shifts, we saw in 2019 there was a huge amount of interest in emissions. In fact, that was all we really heard about in 2019. And this year, that's kind of disappeared from the agenda to a certain extent. The news headlines have all been about COVID. But for sure, this is going to return. And we are working on it. So GRSB is already working on setting a goal for climate. We know that there are huge potentials for reducing emissions, both in terms of the enteric emissions, so reducing the enteric emissions directly from cattle, but also in terms of sequestering carbon in the soils. And we really need to be proactive in doing that and in demonstrating that we're having a positive impact on that. So that's why we're setting a goal, and we're going to have a numerical target. It's not yet finalized, but you will be able to learn about what that goal is early in the new year. Now, the IPCC and IMF both believe in targeting demand for meat, and they talk about taxes on emissions and therefore effectively a meat tax. Depending on what you value carbon at and where you set the price, that could have a significant impact on the price of beef. If you were to set that price around about $15, it would increase the price of beef a little bit. If you were to have a price for carbon as high as $75, that would really be a major impact on beef, and particularly beef from countries where there is still deforestation happening. So Brazil, in that case, would see quite a significant impact on beef prices. So GRSB, as I said, is setting a goal. There are already other countries who've done this. Australia has a carbon neutral by 2030 goal for the beef industry. New Zealand has the ambition to become carbon neutral. And the Canadian Roundtable for Sustainable Beef has already published their goal, which is around reducing emissions per kilo, preserving the soil carbon in existing rangelands, and adding to that soil carbon. So those are the sorts of targets you can envisage coming, and they are essential targets for the beef industry to be able to demonstrate that we are part of a more sustainable food system. So yeah, I don't have a crystal ball any more than anybody else does, and all of the material I presented today has been gathered from sources like Rabobank and our own members, from the FAO Global Agenda for Sustainable Livestock. All of these people are involved in looking at these issues just as much as I am. And I guess the question is, what have we really learned? Of course, this pandemic, the COVID pandemic, will eventually end. There are very promising signs that a vaccine is going to be available in some places even before the end of this year, and then over the course of the coming year would be rolled out much more widely. But the economic impacts won't be as easy to overcome. A recession of this magnitude doesn't just disappear. And for sure, some of those aspects of consumer behavior are going to continue into the future. As I already mentioned, online purchasing, the desire to buy local, and for sure those perceptions on intensive systems. We've seen that grow over time, and of course, definitely in those markets where people have more disposable income, they have the luxury to talk about intensive systems and the ethics thereof. But I think that trend is going to grow and definitely is going to continue. So we need to build trust with consumers. We need to be talking to them more openly about what we do. We need transparency in our supply chains so that we can demonstrate where it comes from and how it was produced. And to my impression this year, appalling though it has been in human terms and also in economic terms, it has really increased the momentum for sustainability at all levels of the supply chain. And GRSB itself, we've seen really enhanced participation in the Global Roundtable for Sustainable Beef. Now, the G20, the World Bank, OECD, Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, they all recognize the importance of livestock, and they all recognize that it's part of a thriving food system. But they also recognize that there are dangers of zoonoses, and we need to be very much on top of how we manage livestock production systems to limit any negative impacts they might have. On the other hand, the great food transformation, as you've probably heard of from the UN Environment Programme, the World Economic Forum, and others, is being ushered in. They're going to be pushing plant-based very strongly, and that is going to compete against beef and other meats. I believe it will take its place alongside them, but there are definitely people within that great food transformation who want to see demand for meat being severely curtailed, and that they are going to keep that in the headlines. So that is another reason that we need to be continuing to communicate effectively. So thank you very much for listening in, and I hope it's been useful.